an earlier period, an earlier time, which men and women did so much to fight their way out of. It's certainly true that it's very easy to accept new realities, new circumstances, new inequalities, striking inequalities of the kind we now have, if everyone else treats them as normal. We can take Tolstoy's word for this. In Anna Karenina, he observes in passing that there are, and I quote, no conditions of life to which a man cannot get accustomed, especially if he sees them accepted by everyone around him. But this disposition to admire, and I'm quoting again, and almost to worship the rich and the powerful, and to despise, or at least to neglect, persons of poor, mean condition, is the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. Those are not my words. Those are the words of Adam Smith, who regarded the risk that we would come to admire wealth, despise poverty, admire success, scorn failure. That's the greatest risk, the greatest sentimental, ethical risk that we faced in the new commercial society that he could see coming. And it's now upon us. Well, let me give you perhaps what seems to be the most striking example of the kind of problem we face. And it comes in the form of what will strike many of you as a rather anodyne economic process, the process of privatization. In the last 30 years, the cult of privatization has taken over Western governments. Why? The shorthand version is that it's cheap. If you have an inefficient public program or publicly owned activity, whether it's a waterworks, an electric company, a trade system, a factory, you sell it. If you sell it, you bring money into the state. You sell it to someone in the private sector, they're more efficient because of the profit motive. The thing in question works better. The state offloads an inappropriate responsibility, and the public sector earns a bit of money in the sale. But that's the theory. The practice is very different. What we've experienced over the last 30 years is the steady unloading of public responsibility into the private sector. In the first place, this is not efficient. Most of the things that governments have seen fit to offload onto the private sector, they wanted to offload because they're not profitable. Whether it's a railway company or a coal mine or a utility, a gas utility or whatever. And in order to get people to buy it in a public offering, when they sell it, they have to sell it cheap. When they sell it cheap, the public takes a loss. I'll give you one example. It's been calculated that when, in the course of the Thatcher-Blair privatizations from 1980 through the late 1990s, because of the deliberately low price at which long-standing public assets were sold to the private sector, £14 billion was transferred from the tax-paying public to the private purchasers. A further £3 billion was transferred to the City of London in the form of fees, charges to the banks which handle the transactions. £17 billion, $30 billion, in other words, shifted from the public to the private sector in order to get the private sector to buy public assets they would not otherwise have been willing to buy. $30 billion, that's, give or take, the endowment of Harvard, the annual gross domestic product of Paraguay or Bosnia-Herzegovina. That's a very large sum of money. It's not obviously an efficient way for a government to use public money. Secondly, the famous question of moral hazard arises. The reason that people in the private sector are willing to buy apparently inefficient public sector goods is because the public sector underwrites the outcome. Buy this railway, or in the case of London, give you a precise example, buy the London Tube. If it doesn't make a profit, we will compensate you. If it does make a profit, it's yours. Now, firstly, this undermines the classic economic argument for privatization, which is that the profit-based private sector will be more efficient. Secondly, of course, by promising someone that even if they don't make a profit, they make a profit, you undermine their motive to make a profit. This is called, pretentiously, moral hazard. But thirdly, most of the goods which the state sells off, it sells off because it cannot itself run them very well, but is nonetheless obliged to regulate in one form or another. And as a consequence, it continues to subsidize, support, guarantee the private activities which remain half public, half private. This is not just inefficient, it takes us back to a very old story about the way states discredit themselves. If you are audited today, my apologies to those members of the audience under 21, for whom this may not seem to matter very much, but for those of you who might imagine being audited in this country or in England, you will not be audited by the state. You'll be audited by a private company which has contracted with the state. Pretty much the same way that private companies contracted with the government in Iraq, or the way private companies in England today contract with the government to provide residential care services for the elderly. The government farms out, in other words, its responsibilities to private companies. In the 18th century in France, this was called tax farming. The government was not very efficient, not very good collecting taxes. So what it would do would be to invite bids from private individuals to collect the taxes for it. The highest bidder got to be the tax collector. He was then free to collect as much money as he could, and it all went to him. He, in turn, paid the government the agreed figure, the government discounting, so to speak, its tax income for the guarantee that it would get something. And then the guy would go out and screw the peasants in any way he could to get the maximum amount in. It was decided after the fall of the Ancien regime that this is a very inefficient system. Firstly, it discredits the state. Secondly, you bring in less money than you otherwise would. Thirdly, you get very disgruntled peasants. In this country today, we have a discredited state, and less money comes in than otherwise would. Curiously, what's the matter with Kansas? we don't get disgruntled peasants. But the problem is the same. We have sold many of the state's responsibilities to the private sector. The advantage of this is clear in terms of reducing the state's responsibilities, but the price is clear. It reduces the state's credibility and its standing. What you get are gated communities, in many senses of the word. Communities, parts of society, that do not feel that they deal directly with the state. They deal with intermediary individuals. They deal with private entrepreneurs acting for the state or doing things the state used to do, but doing them either less well or at a higher cost. And in either case, reducing our sense of allegiance to the state, proximity to the state, and commonality with fellow citizens. This has been very well theorized by one of its greatest practitioners, Margaret Thatcher, notoriously said of social policy, and I quote, "There is no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women and families." But if there are only individual men and women and families, and the state keeps its distance from them, and there is no sense of collective responsibility, collective activity, collective goods that we share in common and for which the state is responsible, whether those goods are a road, the provision of medical care, the collecting of taxes, the provision of armed protection. We now have private police forces, something that the modern state spent 100 years working to get rid of in the course of the 19th and early 20th century. If you don't have those things, then you lack anything that separates the individual from the state. And all you have is the state as a repressive force, the state as an absent government, and individuals at the bottom competing for power and position within the space between them and that state. The consequences of this are not attractive. They were not attractive before the modern state arose, and it was well observed in the early years of the building modern responsible states that the idea, and I quote again, is essentially repulsive of a society held together only by the relations and feelings arising out of private interest. That was written by John Stuart Mill, another great liberal classical economist. What then is to be done? Where can we go from here? We have to begin with the notion of the state. The state as the incarnation of collective interests, collective purposes, collective goods. The state which the